Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And I had an extended long weekend, but today we are continuing our occasional Churchill Reassessed series with a look not at the war years, but the vital period before 1939 and his extraordinary meetings at Chartwell. I'm joined by Katherine Carter from Chartwell, author of Churchill Citadel. Here's my copy there. And links to purchase it are in the description below, or you can find it in your own favorite local bookstore. I'll bring Katherine in now. Good evening, Katherine. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for having me as well.
Thank you for having me. So you have joined the ranks of, what is it, over 1,000 books about Churchill. It's an extraordinary literary array about him. But before we get into the subject, you had a nice kind of parameters because you are at Chartwell and he was there for a particular period of his career. It meant that at least you had kind of a beginning and an end to the project. Because with a guy who lived that long, if you do a whole biography like Andrew Roberts says, it could be 10 years of your life working on this.
Yes, well, this book, it has taken me 4 years, so it's taken me a little while. Churchill was at Chartwell from the mid-1920s until the end of his life. So actually, it's quite a big chapter of his life. But I've zoomed in on the 1930s because for me, that is such a pivotal period of his life, and so much of which plays out behind the doors of Chartwell, although that isn't terribly well known. So that's what I'm very excitedly able to bring out in Churchill Citadel.
Exactly, and that there we've got some photos. And there he is doing his bricklaying. Another string to his bow that people don't know is that he didn't just live there; he did lots of the work and the landscaping and the building and the construction himself and the interior design, etc., along with his wife, of course. So, the 1930s. I think I want to start, Katherine, with so many of the media portrayals of Churchill kind of center on, in terms of World War II, the Chamberlain era, the becoming prime minister, the war had already been underway, but he has seen the writing on the wall for at least a decade. How planned was his kind of return to power, and how random was it? Did he bend with the breeze? Was he driven? Was it a bit of both? Give us a bit of a background as to how he approaches the 1930s.
In terms of Winston Churchill as an individual, he has this incredible sense of his own destiny. So up until 1930, say, the most senior office he'd held in British politics was Chancellor of the Exchequer. But then by the 1930s, he's on the backbenches in what he called his wilderness years. So it's during this time when, because he is spending less time in Westminster and writing more, he goes on a trip to Germany in the summer of 1932. He's researching the biography he's writing of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. And it's while he's there on this trip in August 1932. So at this point, the Nazi Party is increasing in size, but Adolf Hitler isn't yet Chancellor. But even then, he senses what he later calls in the House of Commons a war mentality. And he even says that there will be another conflict with Germany if steps aren't taken immediately. And he's saying that in 1932. So you're absolutely right that it isn't correct to look at the 1930s and think actually Winston Churchill is only really sounding the alarm about Germany from 1937, 38, 39. It's happening much, much earlier than that.
And we were just talking before going live, it seems inconceivable to us now, knowing the full extent of what the Third Reich did to, set about destroying the world and murdering millions of people, that his view was actually not the mainstream one. Certainly in the early 1930s, obviously when the war clouds have got thicker, his view is becoming a bit more common. But early on, he's not quite a lone voice, but he identifies people who are in his way of thinking. So who are some of the key players he keeps around him in the early 30s, who he, of course, meets at Chartwell?
Well, at this point in the 1930s, the outset of my book is 1932. There is such recent memories of the horrors of the First World War. And so in a way, it is perhaps understandable that so much of the establishment is absolutely set on demilitarization as a means of securing peace. So anyone who is sounding the alarm that, Britain needed to begin preparing for war was going against the consensus at that point in the early 1930s, certainly. And also at that point in 1932, like I said, Adolf Hitler hadn't yet become Chancellor, and we hadn't seen this awful domino effect that then
Yeah.
happens over that decade. In terms of those who remain loyal to him despite him being out of high political office, he has a very small circle. And the people who come to see him at Chartwell are at that point his closest friends and confidants. I think one interesting way to look at Chartwell, and for anyone who's not been, I highly recommend it. Like I said, it was his home for 40 years. It's the place that was dearer to his heart than anywhere else in the world. And when you go, it's interesting that a lot of people have in their mind something more like Blenheim Palace, you know, a huge stately home. But actually, Chartwell is much more relatable in scale. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a mansion, but it's not a palace.
It's
And
not
consequently,
palatial, is it? I mean, we had that conversation when you kindly took Mag and I round earlier this year. It's grander than a 3 up, 3 down in Wandsworth, but it's not like the Prince Regent's Palace in Brighton or something. It doesn't feel ostentatious. It's homely, which we'll come back to on the choosing of home turf to meet people, because it is his home turf, isn't it? He's comfortable there to kind of feel open about and not with people listening to him and criticizing it. It's very much where he feels the most comfortable, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It is the place where he brings the people who are either very, very close to him or he has great reason to trust. And the people who are coming to Chartwell are either the ones that he wants to influence and persuade come around to his way of thinking, or those from whom he needs to glean some information, insight, intelligence, whatever it may be that they can bring, that he then adds to his knowledge arsenal, if you will, to then try and sound the alarm through speeches in the House of Commons, through the articles that he's writing. But just to what I was saying a moment ago about the scale of Chartwell, if you go in the dining room, a lot of people expect, Winston Churchill's house will have a long banqueting table. Well, in fact, it's a relatively small round table that can seat maybe sort of 8-10 people at a push. So what Winston Churchill wanted was for you to come to Chartwell, and if he wanted to get some information from you, he wanted you to feel like you were in a really sort of exclusive space, really, really cozy, close, comfortable, feel at ease, and then, over fine wine and discussion over dinner to kind of relax and find yourself kind of having these very honest conversations about what Britain needed to be doing to prepare for war.
And we're going to talk about some of the people he brings there, because I mean, just from the back cover of the book, I mean, it sounds like a who's who of the 1930s, frankly, isn't it? It's not just politicians, it's T. Lawrence, it's Einstein, it's American politicians. And is there always method with who he invites, or are some of them a bit kind of random because he doesn't really know where he might find the next information for does he sit down and kind of plan it like a military campaign? Well, this year, here are the main players I want to meet. How does he find out who the shakers and movers are? What's his process like?
It's a combination of the two. It is either people who he has had come to him sort of organically. So say, for example, Joseph P. Kennedy, who later becomes the American ambassador in London. That meeting comes about because a mutual friend of theirs says, this chap's coming to London and he's pretty influential and I think you should maybe have a conversation with him. So that's reactive because he is making his way to London and a friend says you should talk to him. Whereas there are others where it is a very methodical sort of rapport building over time and making them feel comfortable. So an example of that would be Heinrich Brüning. So he was Chancellor of Germany from 1930 to 1932, finds himself understandably rather nervous at the outset of the Nazi regime. There are contemporary references to him looking like a sort of animal who's being hunted at that point in time. And you can see actually from this photograph, this is not a sort of confident man at this point. He is someone there's a nervousness there, I think. And he comes to see Churchill at Chartwell numerous times, bringing the information that he is gleaning from his contacts who are still in Germany at this point. He's fled by the time he is seeing Winston Churchill. So that is a carefully cultivated, methodical way of continuing to have intelligence coming directly to him at Chartwell. But then you've got others, like I say, where it's someone saying you should consider inviting this chap to your house.
And the other thing that I think is so interesting is the fact that there's stuff here he's finding out that is official, and there's other stuff that's kind of unofficial that he can't really do anything with except kind of squirrel it away in his storage cabinet of ideas for the future, because there are niceties involved. There are diplomatic relationships. There are countries that have agreements, and Chartwell at this point, it's not an official place to conduct meetings of a national security basis, are there, for example? So he obviously has people around him in terms of security and advisors that he trusts. We had a couple of questions coming in earlier on. So, for example, Darren says, was his bodyguard Walter Thompson with him at this point, for example?
Not at this point, although he does come back right before, so summer of 1939.
And then Trevor asked, what role did Major Desmond Morton, Churchill's PA, have at the Chartwell gatherings? Part of his inner circle at this time?
Absolutely. There are a handful of figures. Desmond Morton is the essentially head of the Industrial Intelligence Unit. And a lot of the time when information comes to Winston Churchill that is of a certain ilk that it could do with someone with Morton's expertise, just to cast his eyes over and put it into sort of layman's terms almost, that is where he is incredibly valuable. And there's numerous times where there's letters back and forth between Churchill and Desmond Morton, where Churchill has clearly sent Desmond Morton something and said, can you read through this? What do you think? So he's also someone who Churchill trusts enormously at that point in time.
Thank you. So I'll let you kind of steer the way a little bit out with some of the people you want to talk about, because I mean we could be here all night if we talk about everybody that he spoke to at Chartwell. But I kind of want to bring it back to the idea, if you can expand on it, of how much of this was planned, and whether he, for example, he ever doubted his own conviction. I mean, again, it seems ridiculous for us to doubt now that the Nazis were a terrible, evil regime, but it was, as I say, that wasn't the popular thought back then. Did he ever think that he was on the wrong side? He backed his convictions were wrong? Or was he always firmly, no, this guy Hitler is a wrong one?
I've never found any evidence, any record to indicate doubt in his mind on that score. It was with absolute certainty that he felt that the Nazi regime was something to be very alarmed by. And in fact, there is an article that he writes in November 1935 for the Strand magazine called The Truth About Hitler. And that is one of the boldest moves he makes. And actually, there is a German diplomatic protest in response to this article of Winston Churchill's. Like I said, this is 1935 at this point. So Churchill he's definitely confident that he is on the right side of history. Where we see annoyance is frustration that people aren't listening to him. And unfortunately, there are numerous instances over his career where Churchill politically backs the wrong horse, you could say. So, for example, in the abdication crisis, Churchill arguably called that one completely wrong. Interestingly, Clementine, his wife, actually was far more astute to the public mood at that point and was very pro George VI ascending to the throne in his brother's place. But there's just too many things like that where people began to question Winston Churchill's kind of political acumen. And unfortunately, you've got these other things going on at the same time that he is desperately trying to say, Germany is arming at breakneck speed. Why on earth are we entering into things like the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935, which lets Germany increase rapidly its production of ships and sort of maritime equipment, and that is something that Britain is agreeing to in 1935, and this is 2 years into his time as essentially head of state. And after so many instances where, for example, the Night of the Long Knives I've mentioned earlier, interestingly, there is a visitor who is someone who was being pursued during the Night of the Long Knives, who then comes to Chartwell in 1937. He was the former transport secretary in the early 1930s. And in fact, SS officers turn up at his house when he's playing tennis in the garden. And he ends up sort of evading capture, being, sort of bullets all around him as he's fleeing his home. And he then comes directly to Chartwell and tells Winston Churchill about his experience. And so you've got these remarkable meetings happening at Chartwell. which involve either sort of, brown envelopes being handed to Churchill. Here's my understanding of kind of Germany's rearmament. First-hand accounts of persecution, and another one that I think is a really interesting one is a gentleman called Stefan Laurent, who becomes editor of the Picture Post in the UK, but he is a political prisoner for a time in Nazi Germany, and then comes to Chartwell later in the 1930s and can offer that perspective as well. So Churchill's got this really rich tapestry of intelligence that he is then able to use. And as the decade wears on, and the awful sort of domino effect of Nazi aggressive foreign policy starts to manifest from, the German troops re-entering the Rhineland, Austria, Sudetenland, and so on, finally people come round, but only because Churchill has been making this point, like I said, from as early as 1932.
And this is what I think we're going back to. Thank you for that, by the way. This idea that there wasn't a single moment where suddenly people started really listening to Churchill. There were some key moments in that, but it was kind of a gradual process of him being kind of a nuisance. And oh God, what's he up to now? To the gradual realization amongst other people within the UK and the empire that maybe the old fool is onto something here. But was it a kind of a gradual realization? Did the process of the 30s kind of have peaks and troughs? Did he kind of get close to convincing that Ferris wheel, then kind of lose way again? Was it a sort of a steady trajectory?
It depends who you're talking about in terms of coming around to Churchill's way of thinking.
Yeah,
Actually, the general public seemed to pivot towards being in favor of him returning to government far quicker than the establishment do, interestingly. So there's a letter from Neville Chamberlain writing to his sister earlier in 1939 saying that the campaign to get Churchill back into government is a conspiracy. I was like, that's early 1939. Surely by this point you've had the Munich Agreement, and it's so obvious, to us at least, it seems so obvious that, it's going to sort of carry on having this effect. Churchill even says in his speeches, this is exactly what the Nazis want. They have this all planned out. They have this very well-timed, methodical approach. They're getting everything they want. They're getting, the results of defeat without war. We're just handing them what they want. And it is interesting that there is such objection to him in Westminster for so long, even though there is public outcry. There's even support in the press. There's political cartoons that are coming out much earlier, sort of, in late 1938, early 1939, mocking the establishment in Westminster for not already having brought Churchill back.
And we'll go back to some of the people that go to Chartwell in a second, but I think again some of the framework we get from media presentations is the people he's at loggerheads with during the 30s, the Chamberlains and the Lord Halifax and those kind of people, but actually the supporters, the people, the fringe people who are actually maybe in some ways 80 years on kind of secondary figures, but key figures back there. So let's talk about Archie Sinclair, for example, because he's one of those people that from that era that maybe isn't in people's list of 10 people who are influential in this part of Churchill's life, but he's a key player, isn't he? So tell us a bit more about him.
Archie Sinclair is someone that Winston Churchill has known for a very long time. They actually served together in the First World War. So, a friendship forged in the fires of war. When Winston Churchill was a member of the Liberal Party from 1904 to 1924, he and Archie Sinclair were of the same party. Archie Sinclair becomes leader of the Liberal Party. So when they meet, they're on the same side. Winston Churchill in 1924 crosses the floor. He moves back to the Conservatives, whom he has been with at the outset of his political career. And yet this friendship remains. And I always find that really interesting with Winston Churchill is he can be often at fierce loggerheads with people within the debating chamber of the House of Commons because he is campaigning for what he thinks is right. But ultimately, he can still maintain enduring and rewarding friendships with people across the political spectrum. Archie Sinclair's visit in terms of Churchill's Citadel relates to the abdication crisis. So this is 1936, and essentially there is a constitutional crisis is seemingly moments away, because Edward VIII would like to marry the American twice divorcee Wallis Simpson. And in light of the fact that it's easy to forget now that the instability of monarchies at that point in time, there have been numerous monarchies that have toppled in the aftermath of the First World War. And Churchill is a traditionalist, and he holds monarchy as a concept very dear at this point in time. And so he and Archie Sinclair and others meet at Chartwell early in December 1936, so days before the abdication, trying to come up with a plan to essentially buy time. So a lot of people look at Churchill's stance with the abdication crisis and think, oh, it's out of friendship for his friend Edward VIII, or it's out of a belief in true love, or whatever you want to call it. I actually think it's more that he wants to undermine Stanley Baldwin's government, combined with the fact, and actually this is something I focus on in this chapter of my book, he is getting so many letters sent to him at Chartwell of people declaring their support for Edward VIII and for Edward VIII's marriage to Wallis Simpson. So actually, Churchill is a political player to his bones. And if he is getting, bags of posts saying that actually public consensus is that this should happen, maybe let's not rush, and let's actually try and play for time. Let's find reasons in constitutional precedent that there can be a delay. And who knows, actually, maybe Edward VIII might lose interest in Wallis Simpson. He'd had mistresses before. He'd had a mistress called Frida Dudley Ward, who was another Chartwell visitor at a different point. But Wallis Simpson wasn't the first person he'd loved. So why destabilize the monarchy in this really kind of hasty way in December 1936? So Archie Sinclair, leader of the Liberal Party, and Churchill spend the evening together at Chartwell discussing, okay, what can we do just to try and put the brakes on things? Now, unfortunately, this is one of those moments where Churchill, as I said earlier, he backed the wrong horse, essentially. And unfortunately, he also didn't realise by the time of this meeting in December 1936, Edward VIII has sort of already given up the fight. So unfortunately, you've got Churchill at Chartwell pulling every string he can think of. And Edward VIII, he's decided he's going to abdicate anyway. And there's a really kind of poignant note that follows this meeting and follows the abdication, where there was a debate in the House of Commons where, for various reasons pertaining to Churchill failing to follow due procedure and getting a bit sort of befuddled, he gets shouted down in the House of Commons, which is a really embarrassing thing for Winston Churchill. And Edward VIII later reflects that that's one of the biggest regrets of his life, that the institution that owes so much to Winston Churchill because of his actions resulted in a humiliation for him. But that's another thing about this book, is that not every meeting garners the outcome Churchill hopes for. But that's interesting unto itself, because if every single meeting went Churchill's way, then he would have come to power and influence far sooner. It's a roller coaster of a ride. And so that's the meeting that Archie Sinclair's at.
But he would have said himself, you learn as much from your mistakes as you do from your successes. And if anyone had as equal number of failures in his life as he did successes, it's kind of true. I'd say maybe not equal, but there were certainly some epic things that he got wrong, and back, as you say, backed the wrong horse, as well as the times he got things right. We had a question earlier about the Edward VIII thing, about from Great Dominion. Did he know much about the Nazi sympathies of Edward VIII? Because that was going to put him on a bit of a horns of a dilemma. He doesn't want to destabilize the monarchy, that he wants UK to be united, but there's also this idea that Edward VIII was a friendly with Hitler. Was he aware of that?
So it's worth bearing in mind that at that point in 1936, there was quite a lot of the establishment who were on good terms with senior members of the Nazi Party. Again, this absolute determination to secure peace at all costs, even if it meant sort of seemingly kowtowing to a dictator. So it's not necessarily. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, I mean, was he aware that Edward VIII kind of, by today's standards, would have had Nazi sympathies? But as you say, I think your response was fantastic. Is that if we were going to be questioning everybody who seemed to be in agreement with the Nazis in the UK and the US in the 1930s, that'd be a hell of a lot of people.
Yes, and the the alarm comes later. So after the abdication, you see Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson going on a sort of a tour where there's these sort of, paparazzi shots of, by then the Duke of Windsor kind of smiling and handshaking Adolf Hitler. And it's at that point when Winston Churchill kind of, I'd say, is alarmed. But fortunately, by that point, you've got George VI. There's a different monarch, and Edward VIII is by that point becoming increasingly irrelevant.
No, thank you. Well, let's move on to Harold McMillan, because another really important figure, both before the war, during the war, and indeed the decades after the war. And someone I can't think of in this series very much kind of on Churchill's team, but there's sort of an Obi-Wan Anakin thing in that McMillan kind of ends up kind of becoming more powerful after Churchill. So how was their relationship, and how important was McMillan during this period that we're talking about, the 30s?
Earlier in the 30s, there's a bit of a connection between the two. The problem arises in the fact that Harold McMillan's wife, Dorothy, is unfortunately involved in a rather overt affair with Bob Boothby. Bob Boothby is one of Churchill's inner circle. And so Harold McMillan never concedes to a divorce. So you end up with Dorothy and Harold and Bob Boothby all in this sort of miserable situation. And so understandably, given that Bob Boothby is a regular at Chartwell at this point, I should say Bob Boothby is he is Winston Churchill's former parliamentary private secretary, remains a close ally. Harold McMillan, you can understand he's not opting in to be at the dinner table with the man who's having an affair with his wife. And also, for a lot of the 1930s, he is a member of a different group within the Conservative Party known as the Glamour Boys, who are largely sort of associated with Anthony Eden. But as the 30s wear on, actually, he starts to agree more with Winston Churchill's position. And even though it's, you can imagine, very bitter pill to swallow, does try and get into that close Churchill circle, because he believes genuinely that actually that is the course that we need to be taking as a country. So you see the sort of gradual shift. But what is really interesting as well is the timing of Macmillan's visit to Chartwell, because it is the day where Italy invades Abyssinia, modern day Ethiopia. So he is there and he bears witness to the Chartwell machine coming to life. So as soon as this intelligence makes its way to Churchill at Chartwell, and it was remarkable how quickly things made their way to Chartwell. Winston Churchill knew about the Polish invasion of Germany before a lot of people in Westminster did. So Harold McMillan is there and witnesses, suddenly all these maps coming out, and Churchill sort of looking at them going, where is the fleet? Because they're on the wrong side of Italy. And so there's a brilliant account of his of that moment. But more broadly, it is interesting how the 30s wear on, and even someone with as genuinely good a reason as Harold McMillan to not want to be in Churchill's inner circle, by the end of the decade, there's no avoiding it. If you are of the same ilk as him, you're going to side with him no matter what discomfort you might find yourself in personally in order to do so.
And that's a good way of framing it. The fact you can be part of the circle without necessarily being close. You can be close with someone in terms of professionally dealing with the situation without necessarily being friends. And the reminder that there's this sort of almost soap opera element to the 1930s as well, with all these, the Mitford sisters came up in the sidebar there, and all the circles that politicians moved in there. There's all sorts of intrigue and affairs and secrets and skeletons in cupboards and things like that. That even, I guess, the Churchill family have a certain amount of in their cupboards as well, because that's the nature of the time they were in with these kind of people. But does that make it, for writing the book, did you have to kind of focus on what's important for the narrative and what's just a really cool, wicked, sort of sexy story? How did you keep focused on what am I trying to do here, Katherine?
When I started and I'd sort of come up with my list of what I wanted my chapters to be, there were 28. And I showed this list to various wonderful historians I know, and all of them went, you can't give them 28 chapters, which in a way was quite disheartening. But actually, in order to have this sort of optimal narrative flow and pace and threads that you could follow throughout it, it did need revisiting. And the wonderful thing is, I believe all of those 28 are at the very least mentioned, if they're not given their own chapters. So there were none that I had to put completely by the wayside. But it was a very interesting process. And I think for me, what I found remarkable was actually I didn't have to work that hard, because Churchill did it for me. He was bringing in the right people at the right time. So actually, there wasn't too much constructing of interest and story that I needed to do, because the actual history itself was just so fascinating.
And I think we ought to remind ourselves that these people that came, and the 28 you mentioned there, they're not just from the UK. They're not just from the kind of the British political world. They're from further afield. We mentioned some of Joe Kennedy, but I'm going to put some other people up there on the slides there, because this is an interesting part here. Bringing people in from the all over the known world, as it were. So let's talk about this.
Kuo Tai Chi was probably one of the most exciting moments of my research, because my understanding of that visit came about through one of Clementine's engagement diaries. So there are so many different sources that I combed through: oral histories, correspondences, Winston Churchill's calendar cards. But it was actually in Clementine's diary where it just had Chinese ambassador, 1 o'clock. And I thought and it was in really difficult to read handwriting. I showed it to about 10 people and said, does that say Chinese ambassador? And so it was after that I did some real digging and found out that, in fact, yes, weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War, it's the 11th of August, 1939, Kuo Tai Chi comes to Chartwell, which is absolutely mind-blowing. He's not the first international diplomat to come to Chartwell, but this is something that no historian has ever, as far as I've ever been able to find, been aware of this visit. He brings with him an academic from China called Pengchun Chang, who has, up until the early 1930s, been an academic at Nanking University. And he then essentially goes on almost like a sort of, there are Foreign Office records that say that Chang was undertaking a propaganda tour that I found in the National Archives. And he goes across America, across countries in Europe and Britain, trying to make people aware of the horrors being inflicted by Japanese troops, because at this point, it's an undeclared war. And there's huge amounts of efforts being made by the likes of Chang, by Kuo Tai Chi, within the British government to try and persuade things like economic sanctions on Japan, to try and buy less from them, therefore mean there is less funds to fund their campaigns in China. So this is a really, really interesting visit. And actually, it is around this time that Churchill makes a remarkably prophetic broadcast on NBC from his desk at Chartwell. And there's a photo of this moment in the book itself, where he is broadcasting to the United States, again, desperately trying to make the American population aware that global war was coming. And so he's referencing the Munich Agreement, he's referencing what's going on in Europe. But thanks to the information that Chang and Kuo Tai Chi have brought to him at Chartwell, he can also use real world understanding and their accounts in his explaining that actually war is already underway. Although it's undeclared, war is happening already on an international scale. And the ripple effect is going to hit across Europe sooner or later, if the sort of alliances play out where Japan and Italy and Germany do in fact form an alliance. And Kuo Tai Chi has a really remarkable role later in the war. He is at this point China's ambassador in London, but then he gets recalled to China to be the foreign secretary. And it is he who, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, makes the declaration that China is now at war with Japan. So he also has this incredibly poignant place in global history as well. And so the fact that he is making his way to Chartwell, when Churchill is, let's not forget, at this point, still a backbench MP.
Yep.
In August 1939, he still has, in a official sense, very little influence over international events. But such is the rapidly growing wave of belief that Winston Churchill surely must be getting called back into the government sooner or later, that you have international diplomats coming to Chartwell. And not only that, Kuo Tai-chi, shortly after this, essentially becomes an intermediary between Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek. So he, in the letters between Churchill and Kuo Tai-chi, is passing on messages from Chiang Kai-shek. So such an important moment in history that no one seems to have realised before, and I'm really excited to be able to share it in Churchill Citadel.
That is an amazing bit, and I'm bringing it back to what we said earlier. This idea that, you know, when Churchill becomes prime minister, that he's arriving with, I don't know, an empty briefcase and no ideas, and is having to be filled in all the details of what's happening around the world is patently nonsense. You know, he's probably got as big a picture, if not the biggest picture, of anybody in the UK at this point through these extraordinary meetings he's been having over the last, you know, few years. So we've got lots of viewers watching from the USA who are intrigued about American visitors. Obviously, we mentioned Joe Kennedy earlier, so we can bring him back up then. Where's Joe Kennedy? There we are. No, there we are. So there we are. So Scott asked, since FDR didn't visit the UK during his presidency, did any key FDR aides, such as Harry Hopkins, visit Chartwell? Or if they weren't, who was from the USA visiting Chartwell? Well, obviously Kennedy.
Yes. So, well, the thing is, in terms of the likes of Harry Hopkins, that pertains more to once war has broken out in terms of his time in the UK. And by that point, because Chartwell it's known to be a target for the Luftwaffe. And in fact, in the, you know, Hitler's black book of places to make a beeline for following the successful invasion of Britain, Chartwell, you know, is listed very highly in that list. So for that reason, meetings aren't happening at Chartwell so much during the war. In fact, there's very few instances where Churchill is there because it's known to be a target. However, if you look at somewhere like Ditchley, which is the residence that Churchill would go to when Chequers was thought to be at too much risk, you know, when the skies were clear, head to Ditchley. There's a wonderful moment where he's meeting Harry Hopkins in the library at Ditchley. Maybe that'll have to be my next book, The Meetings at Ditchley.
Next book, meetings during the war, you know. But I mean, Joe Kennedy, I think, is another person that is perceived differently now than perhaps he was back then. There's sort of the whole Kennedy clan have come in and out of favor in history over the decades. But back then, long before we perceived of his son becoming president, Joe Kennedy was an incredibly influential figure, if not with some interesting character traits. But what was his and Churchill's relationship like?
So their first meeting was as the result of this introduction made by Bernard Baruch, a very good friend of Churchill's, based in the USA. And so Joe Kennedy and his wife Rose come to Chartwell, and there is a wonderful 4-page long synopsis that Rose writes of this visit, which is in the Kennedy Presidential Library in the US. And, you know, that is absolute gold dust to a historian. And what Rose relays is that essentially this meeting is Winston Churchill pitching a sort of Anglo-American naval police force. Broadly is sort of what he is asking of, you know, Kennedy's opinion on. And the problem is Kennedy just doesn't take to Churchill as a character. It's really interesting. This is probably one of the least successful of the meetings, because there are other people who welcome the Kennedys into their home during this visit to England, and they are given, you know, the red carpet treatment in a way where people are just asking them questions and hanging on their every word. The Kennedys go to Chartwell and Churchill goes straight into campaign mode. He has got limited time with these people and he wants to put his point across. And it's just really jarring compared to the reception they've had at all these other society events that they've been to during their stay. And there's an interesting remark of Kennedy's later in the 30s where he says, "I just don't trust him." And imagine that, Winston Churchill welcomed this man into his home in a desperate attempt to try and secure some sort of Anglo-American alliance in a way. And Kennedy's gone, do you know what? I just don't get a good feeling about him. I don't think he's I don't think we should go with what he's saying. And one of the really interesting things I found in the National Archives was years later, so once Churchill is Prime Minister during the Second World War itself, there is an instance where someone overhears Joe Kennedy on a plane saying, "I hate all Englishmen from Churchill down." And can you imagine that? And that report makes its way to Brendan Bracken, who then passes it on to Winston Churchill. And you can just imagine Winston Churchill's reaction to that. This is a man he'd had in his home, who he'd hoped to form a rapport and a friendship with for the securing of, international peace. And he's there on planes just sort of bad-mouthing him. So it's unfortunately a relationship that doesn't flourish following the visit.
But incredibly important for Churchill to learn, who are his future allies, who can he depend on, who can he not depend on, and the other thing that we're talking about is even within his own family. I'm going to mention Sarah, because another important figure there, because Chartwell is not just the home to Churchill, it's the home to the Churchill extended family who are coming in and out, and they're inviting people, and they have relationships, they have husbands and partners and that. So there's a whole array of people coming through Chartwell with different sorts of agendas, in that just kind of visiting the family home. So you wanted to talk about, you talk about these two in the book. So how do they figure into Chartwell in this whole period in history?
Well, more broadly, I'm really glad that you've mentioned that, because actually I think one of the things that I'm most proud of with this book is that I think I have managed to balance high politics and diplomacy, but also the everyday family domestic life.
Yeah.
I've been able to make use of things like oral histories from the secretaries, the memoirs of the children, accounts from, the chauffeur who's at one point kind of lamenting that he's doing too many late nights and he's knackered, and, he quits because Clementine bites his head off at one point, and he goes, "Do you know what? I've had enough." And, that kind of the everyday running of a country house. And yes, the family are, of course, a huge part of that. So this is Sarah Churchill. This is their third child. And she is, by this point, she's trained to be a dancer. And she meets this gentleman, Vic Oliver, while she is in her first kind of formal production as a dancer called Follow the Sun. And Sarah's had a few crushes earlier in her life, but she's not really had kind of relationships. You wouldn't at that point in time, of course. She's been a debutante in sort of society, but she's still quite naive to the ways of gentlemen, shall we say. Vic Oliver, however, is much older. He's divorced, and so when Sarah brings him home to meet Winston Churchill, it doesn't go terribly well. And Clementine is away at this point, but Winston Churchill writes to her saying that he thought Vic Oliver was common as dirt, is the phrase that's used. And he cannot see what Sarah sees in him at all. And in fact, Clementine, who meets Vic Oliver later, echoes this. She says something like, if this happened in the medieval period, people would assume she'd been subject to witchcraft or something like that. So actually Sarah, she's so canny. She plays it really cool. She goes, "Do you know what? I can see that he's probably not right for me," and plays it as if she is kind of moving on. And then she elopes. She heads across the Atlantic to New York, where Vic Oliver is. He has sent her a telegram shortly before she runs away, which I was made aware of by an oral history from one of the secretaries, where she references a maid having pulled out a sort of screwed up ball in a bin, which was a telegram from Vic Oliver saying, "Please do nothing precipitate, darling." So he's saying, don't run away, don't do anything silly. She ignores it. She makes a beeline for him in New York. Randolph then follows her across the ocean to try and, I don't know, save her honor or something. Randolph being the second child, her older brother. Yep. So there's international headlines. So this is all going on at the same time as Winston Churchill is having to deal with not just the political situation. He is at this point midway writing his million-word biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. He is having to write articles constantly to bring in enough money to pay the bills. And then he's got this daughter who's just gone and eloped and caused, international headlines. So it's just another really interesting part of the rich tapestry of what life is like for the Churchills at Chartwell, and it's histories that aren't so well known that are nonetheless fascinating.
But do you think the fact that his family life could be fraught aided him in terms of concentrated? Did it give him distractions to kind of other things to worry about for a day in between, the world about to blow itself up again? Or would he prefer to just be able to focus on, with clarity, on the problems of the state, so to speak? I mean, Einstein's find that a distraction of a cat not coming back can actually kind of help me focus again, because it takes me away from programming a World War II TV show for a minute, and then I can come back to it. So do you think it kind of aided him having other things going on, being a father and a family man as well?
It depends on what the distraction was. With things like his bricklaying, as you showed the picture of earlier, and his painting as well, he had these tools by which he could immerse himself mentally and the concentration in the output of his hands and whatever he was creating. Something like his daughter eloping, however, and she timed it so badly. She did so on her little sister's birthday. So poor Mary, immediately overshadowed by big sister running away. Mary references that as being either the first or the only, I can't remember which, but I think, of those times that she saw her mother cry, which was an incredibly rare thing for Clementine Churchill. And Sarah's elopement provoked that, which would, of course, also have caused great pain to Winston. So I think that there would probably have been some welcome and cultivated distractions through his hobbies and his pastimes. But I think the sort of family upheaval, he probably would have chosen to go without.
Okay. Thank you. I'll bring a few other questions up my own, but there's one from viewers coming in. So Kevin is asking, what are some of the great myths surrounding Churchill and Chartwell? Are there things that you thoroughly debunked in the book that people have believed for years?
I think my overall goal in writing Churchill Citadel was to counter a prevailing view that all of the interesting goings-on relating to Winston Churchill in the 1930s happened in London, and that Chartwell was this sort of idyllic, scenic backdrop, Garden of Eden, where he would escape, and couldn't be further from the truth. It is his factory of words, first and foremost. It is the place where he writes more words than the William Shakespeare and Charles Dickens combined. His output is enormous, and he is working around the clock till 2-3 in the morning, and in due course making his poor secretaries do the same as well, and they often complained about the hours they had to keep in order to work for Winston Churchill. But I, in writing Churchill Citadel, wanted to make Chartwell center stage, and it absolutely should be. And there are instances of awareness of visitors coming. So perhaps someone might know Albert Einstein visited, and it might be reeled off in a list of names, sort of a who's who, Charlie Chaplin, Vivian Leigh, Albert Einstein. But why was he there? How was that introduction made? What was the geopolitical context that made Albert Einstein think, I need to go to Winston Churchill's house? And that's what I wanted to do, was to add context, detail, flavor as well of what Chartwell was like, and not just this beautiful place where he would relax.
No, I'm glad you did, because it's not like some kind of, I don't know, celebrity cafe where they have Polaroids on the wall going back 30 years of the time Johnny Depp came in for a tea, and then 10 days earlier it was whatever it was, Bob Geldof or something. This random list of people, nothing was random. It was all, or most of it was calculated. It was part of this knowledge base of acquiring information about the world from these people there, and just fueling his obviously thirst for getting to know people. I mean, he can be seen as kind of a bit reserved and a bit, stuck in his ways and stiff, but actually the fact he was inviting people from this world, he did have an interest, didn't he, in other people's points of view, even if he didn't agree with them.
Yes, it's interesting as well, the way that different individuals have very different experiences at Chartwell. So, for example, T.E. Lawrence, who by this point was going by T.E. Shaw, there is a recollection of Sarah's that when Lawrence spoke, he would do so very softly, and consequently, you could hear a pin drop. Everyone would be absolutely silent. And there weren't many people who Churchill would completely give the floor to, but Lawrence of Arabia was one of them. But usually, and actually one of the things that's come across quite strongly in the reviews of my book so far is the fun of it. And actually that's something I hope people glean as well, that actually a visit to Chartwell and a dinner in that dining room, my gosh, to be a fly on the wall, you would have had the most extraordinary evening, the best champagne, the most fantastic conversation. And I think that it is worth just bearing that in mind, that he created an optimal environment because he wanted people to want to come back. He even wrote a thesis once about the ideal dining room chair. You'd imagine he's got enough.
I'm just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, it's this extraordinary document where he essentially says that it has to have a curved back, and it has to have arms that go under the table, and it can't have legs that sort of splay. They have to sit under the main body of the chair itself. And he is applying that level of thought to creating an environment that people don't want to leave. He wants you to want to sit at that dining room table till 11 at night, midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, however long he wants you there. He wants there to be no variable in the equation, discomfort in your seat being one of them potentially, that could make you want to go. And in fact, what is really interesting is the number of people who go back really frequently. So, there aren't, some of the visitors by definition in the chapters of the book are one-off visits. For example, Einstein, he actually leaves Europe shortly after the visit to Chartwell and doesn't actually return to European soil at all, or Britain. And so that is a one-off. But there are numerous ones of these where they are coming back time and time again, because Chartwell is somewhere you want to be. Churchill is someone you want to be around. He's got that charisma and he has that draw where it's just a brilliant place to be.
So we've got a couple of questions about the recording of these meetings, in the fact you were saying earlier how you found information about them from all these different sources. It wasn't just, one source there. So Peter Finch is asking, was Churchill obliged to keep official records of these meetings at Chartwell?
No, not at all. They are friends coming over for dinner, for lunch, for afternoon tea, for a swim, whatever it may be. So no, because, and also he is at that point not in the government. He is a private citizen having friends and acquaintances over to his home. If people chose to disclose top secret things to him while they're there, great. But no, because he is not in government, there is no need to have an official record. I wish there was. That would make my job as a historian much easier. But it does mean that you are ultimately needing to have several different things to corroborate. So, for example, with a T.E. Shaw visit, I might have a signature in the visitor's book, but I might not. There are a lot of people who didn't sign because signatories tended to be the dine and stay guests. So people who came for dinner and stayed over as well. So a huge number of the visitors bringing information at this point aren't the sorts of people who are staying over. So they're not in the visitor's book. So they might be there, they might not be. You've then got Clement. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to carry on, please.
I was going to say, you've then got Clementine and Winston's engagement cards and diaries listing what they're doing. But then you have letters back and forth. So, for example, T.E. Shaw writes to Clementine after a visit once saying, please pass on my apologies to Mary that I couldn't swim and I couldn't join her in the pool. So I can then say the hope had been that he would go for a swim. You can then kind of reverse it from the accounts at the time. But it's so many different things that then, through this process of alchemy, create understanding of what happened at Chartwell.
Thank you. We had a question from Ian about Churchill's own recording of this history in his own memoirs and what have you, both at the time and later on. Did he have any kind of tendency to kind of exaggerate the effect or the outcome of some of these? Was there a bit of kind of, well, I definitely knew that 10 years earlier? Was he fairly honest in his accounting about it?
So I actually didn't rely too heavily on Winston Churchill's own accounts written later. So the first volume of his 6-volume history of the Second World War is The Gathering Storm.
Yeah.
And one could go and make a beeline straight for that. But actually, that's not a resource that I relied on too heavily, because there was such a wealth of resources, actually discussions back and forth about the meetings at the time. So there's a number of instances where I might go to The Gathering Storm for Churchill's recollection of something if I wanted his specific wording reflecting on it, and it is known from other sources that it happened in a certain way. But secondary sources, and I would include Winston Churchill writing his volume of the Second World War after the war, I genuinely didn't rely on too heavily. I'm the sort of historian who would much rather go to the person who's writing the next day saying, thank you so much for having me over. I enjoyed this enormously. I loved that there was someone who wrote the next day apologizing that they'd accidentally stolen Churchill's eye lotion. So the fact that you've got Winston Churchill, dabbing his eyes, and this guest going, "Oh, can I have a bit of that?" It's those sort of really funny anecdotes as well that come out that I've been able to use from original sources.
Which I'm assuming you wouldn't get from Parliament records, that you nicked something from the sideboard, as it were, so to speak. Yeah. But that's that environment he obviously created there, of it being relaxed and the sort of place where you could borrow a book and bring it back when you're finished with it, kind of thing, rather than official work. So there's a particular question about the bricklaying. What did he actually do? Was he just practicing, Robbie? Was he actually constructing permanent things at Chartwell? I know the answer, but I'll let you explain.
There is actually, I don't know if you can see it on the wall behind me. This is a reproduction of a Churchill painting. And so these are the walls that Churchill built around his walled garden, as it's now known, essentially the productive garden at Chartwell, where fruit and vegetables would be cultivated. So no, they are really sizable structures, and he's building them, like I said, largely as a mechanism for sort of focus. Yeah. He does also reference them as being a sort of a health benefit. There is an exercise to the process as well. But there's a great letter that Churchill writes to Stanley Baldwin in 1928, where he says that I am writing 2,000 words a day and laying 200 bricks a day. So it's a pretty high output for his bricklaying.
Wow, definitely. There's one photo you sent me that we haven't dealt with yet, and that's the Sandys. So let's talk about them, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. I've loved it, by the way.
So this is Diana Churchill, the Churchill's eldest child, and this is her second husband, called Duncan Sands, and their newborn Julian. So Diana is at the very outset, she's married to another gentleman who, unfortunately, that marriage fails. This gentleman who she meets, interestingly, is a rival of her brother's. Randolph Churchill stands for election, but actually this gentleman, Duncan Sands, is against him. And clearly Diana's been on the campaign trail helping her brother, and caught the eye of the candidate on the other side. And they get married. And fortunately, Julian is born around the time of Sarah having eloped. So actually this moment is a moment of kind of joy and hope for the Churchill family. But I do try and address what's going on in each of the children's lives as well, because they are in their own way as integral to the story of Chartwell as Winston and Clementine.
No, absolutely. And I think I'm glad that part is covered, because it was a family home, as well as being this incredibly important steering of the future world location. It was also a family home with the regular goings and outgoings that a family home would have. And the fact that as you said earlier, it's not like he's financially pretty flush during this time. I mean, he's kind of struggling to make ends meet. I mean, thank God it wasn't a palace, otherwise he'd have had to have got rid of it. I mean, he was on his uppers, though. I mean, do people, when they visit Chartwell, do they kind of forget that he was pretty broke during a lot of this period?
It's something that, because he owned the house for 40 years, the house is broadly represented in its layout and sort of styling of the 1930s. But because such a big chunk of Chartwell's history during the Churchill's residency is post-war, at that point you have him financially much more well off.
Yeah.
So there is that side of it as well, where by that point he is a best-selling author of his 6th-volume history of the Second World War. He is traveling internationally all the time. Chartwell has been given to the National Trust actually by 1947, although the understanding is the Churchills can live there for the rest of their lives. So they don't have that financial ball and chain by that point either. So over the course of Chartwell, their finances oscillate between being extraordinarily up and extraordinarily down.
No, thank you. And to bring things up to, if you have to kind of pinpoint one specific meeting or one person that is the most influential in terms of what we are here on World War II TV, the fact that Churchill did guide the Allies, the UK, to victory in World War II, is there a key moment that you can kind of put it back to, that there was that one thing at Chartwell that steered him on the right course, or was it too many to mention?
I genuinely think the weighting of significance spans across all of them. It isn't a narrative where there is sort of kind of a high point where it all sort of comes together. Each meeting informs him of some different element of politics or geopolitics in a different way. So I would say you do need the wider story of the book for the entire context.
That sounds good. So other than that, we'll finish up by saying, obviously, we said at the beginning there are 1,000 plus books about Churchill, but you've done a very good job of explaining what's unique about your one. So I hope people go out there and buy it. But the other thing is, did your affection is probably the right word for Churchill. Obviously, you work at Chartwell. You can't possibly not be a fan of the Churchill family. But did the writing process cause you to change your opinion on anything? Was there things that reinforced your like or caused you to question anything about him and the family?
For me, Winston Churchill is a fascinating figure, but he's made more interesting by being imperfect. So actually, the fact that he is a really difficult employer, the fact that he can be quite self-centered, he's got a hell of an ego on him, there's all these different things that play in, but actually each one of them contributes to him being Winston Churchill, to his confidence, to his courage, whatever it may be. And so I think that it's entirely possible to come out of reading Churchill's Citadel thinking, do you know what, I'm delighted that in the end the establishment listened to him, but actually I can maybe see why they didn't sooner. He was a controversial figure even in his time. So there's definitely all shades of Winston Churchill represented in the book.
No, definitely. And my visit to you and then looking at the book is that they understand that the Chartwell was absolutely central to who he was. It was central to how he made his decisions, how he acquired his knowledge. And again, referring to the kind of the media idea is we think of his kind of his home as being standing up in the Houses of Parliament or speaking on the steps of some, an embassy or at a conference, as we know he did in his career. But actually, kind of the key to it all was the home base, the home field, so to speak, of Chartwell, where he had it laid out how he wanted it, to his requirements, to encourage the conversations he wanted to have. So that obviously was his first love, really. Well, Clementine as well, I guess, and his family. But Chartwell and Churchill kind of they're a partnership.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, if I were to conclude with one thought, Churchill made Chartwell his very own branch of the Foreign Office. That is what it became in the 1930s. And it is thanks to the knowledge that he was able to glean through meetings at his house, I would argue, that ultimately put him in the position of authority to lead come 1940. So it is, world history has changed as a result of the meetings in Churchill's Citadel.
Well, that's an absolutely perfect soundbite to end it on, Katherine. So, folks, you know what to do. There's my copy there, the advanced copy. It's pre-order, available in 3 weeks' time. You can order it from your favorite bookstore or from the links below. And I can't wait to bring you back when you've got a second book out in another I'll put it in 4 years' time, number 2. Yeah, is that where we made a deal? Oh, I think we may have lost Katherine there. But folks, we're back again on Thursday. This is Paul Burnett for World War II TV saying I will see you all again. Thanks for your fantastic questions. Cheers, everybody. Bye.